Well, hello and welcome to the Northern Illawarra Uniting Church sermon for this week. Great to have you with us. We're continuing our sermon series on David today, and this is just one of the most beautiful stories. I'm going to read it for us. This is from 2 Samuel chapter 9. Let me read it for us. David asked, "Is there anyone still left in the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and he was summoned to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "At your service." The king said, "Is there anyone remaining in the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?" And Ziba said to the king, "There remains a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." And the king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar." Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, at Lo-debar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and did obeisance. And David said, "Mephibosheth." And he answered, "I am your servant." And David said to him, "Do not be afraid, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you yourself shall eat at my table always." And he did obeisance and said, "What is your servant that you should look upon a dead dog such as I am?" Then the king summoned the Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him and shall bring in the produce, so that your master's grandson may have food to eat. But your master's grandson, Mephibosheth, shall always eat at my table." And now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do." And Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah. And all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he always ate at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. Well, this story is all about David's showing kindness to Mephibosheth, and we'll get to that in a second. But I want to tell you this morning a little story. I just bought an e-bike, one of those electric bikes that give you a little bit of extra push as you're going up the steep hills. And I have to say, it's a wonderful tool. I use it to get around all around Woonona and Bulli, to church, to visitation. And I have to say, it's good exercise, it's fun, but it's also really good for the environment, from what I hear. It's far better than driving my diesel-burning station wagon. Instead of burning oil, I'm burning a mixture of electricity and my own leg power. It's a much better fuel. But I'm finding this dynamic at work, and maybe you found this when you've been riding a bike or maybe trying to exercise more. I keep going back to old reasons why I should use the car, why I should use the old fuel that I used to use. For example, I was meeting our chairman of our church, Steve Beasley, just earlier this week on Wednesday, and there was sort of a library book mishap at our house in the morning as I was dropping my son Lawrence off to school, so I was running a little late. And I started to say to myself, just this little conversation in my head, that I ought to drive to the meeting rather than riding my bike, because I thought to myself, Steve will be angry if I'm running a little bit late. Now, if you know Steve, and most of you do, you'll realize just how ridiculous that sounds. Can you imagine Stephen Beasley getting a little bit angry just because I was a few minutes late? So all I did was I sent him a text and told him I'd be a few minutes late, and I rode my bike in. But isn't that dynamic familiar to you? If I'm running a little late, or I'm having to carry something, or it's a little cloudy outside, or a little sunny outside, then I keep thinking to myself, well, maybe today I should not ride my bike. I want to use the better fuel, the new fuel, but I keep being tempted to go back to the old fuel, the diesel fuel that makes the world a dirtier, less livable place. I find this tension within me all the time. Our whole world is sort of struggling with this same addiction. We just love oil and gas so much, it's hard to think about running the world on some other kind of fuel. But it's not just our cars and planes that run on bad fuel. We humans, emotionally, spiritually, we can run on bad fuel as well. Most of the time, the thing that really kicks me and perhaps you into high gear emotionally is a bad emotion, like worry or anger. If I want something done, anger or worry are like the high-end supernitrate petrol that really gets me going. If I'm doing something, I'm falling behind, I suddenly get worried, and so I work harder. Or someone does something to me and it really angers me, and so I really just kick into high gear emotionally. Some days I get out of bed and I just keep running into annoying people. Maybe you've had this feeling before. Everyone in the traffic or in the line, the queue at Woolies, everyone in my family, they just find a way to push my buttons. And this fuel of anger just sort of charges through my day. Or some nights, instead of resting, my brain is buzzing, running 100 kilometers an hour with new things to worry about. Anger and worry and all other kinds of negative emotions seem to be the ultimate renewable resource. We humans seem to have an endless supply for worry and anger. It's amazing, isn't it? How easy it is to find something to worry about or something to complain about. We have these incredibly sensitive radars for finding worry and finding causes for offense. I can get into moods, and maybe you recognize this, when even a nice action can anger me. Ever get in that mood where someone says good morning to you in a way that just seems too happy and too over the top to you, and it makes you angry? You're like, what are you so happy for? That's not even touching on all the legitimate reasons we have for anger. For whatever reason, if we want to be angry, we will find something to be angry about. And if we want to be worried, we will find something to worry about. Where I used to live in California, there's a famous house called the Winchester Mystery House. You can pay, I think, $18 and go and walk through the Winchester Mystery House. It's called the Winchester Mystery House because it's just this incredible house with 100 different doors and windows and wings and different stairs all over the place. It was owned and constructed under the direction of Sarah Winchester, who was the heir to the Winchester rifle fortune. The story goes that she was so haunted by the fear of all the millions of people killed over the years by Winchester rifles that she sought out mediums and spiritualists. This is sort of late 1800s, early 1900s when that was popular to do. She sought out psychics to protect her from these spirits. And apparently one of them told her that the spirits would never get her or harm her while she was not yet settled in her home. And so Sarah Winchester took this to mean that until her house was finished being built. So Sarah Winchester kept building her house, adding additions, tearing down and rebuilding towers, adding staircases, windows, doors, wings. The house would never be finished. And so it was. The building continued until 1922 when, I guess they got her. Sarah Winchester passed away in 1922. So you can visit it now and pay the $18 and you'll find staircases that go to nowhere, windows that open to nothing, doors that open to the outside even if they're on the third or fourth floor. So many different wings and halls and rooms. Her whole life, Sarah Winchester's whole life, was driven and fueled by anxiety. Now that's extreme, right? But perhaps you know that feeling in your own life. If you want a reason to be afraid or worried, you can always find one. If you want a reason for anger, there is plenty of reasons out there. If you don't believe me, I just saw the other day that there are tours being organized for tourists from Australia and from Great Britain to go to America to watch the craziness of the American midterm elections. People are paying money to go and see the worry and anger of the American political system. It's how addicted we are to this bad fuel. Now, again, I'm not saying that worry and anger are not sometimes legitimate. Maybe they are. But is that what we want to run our lives on? You know, I've noticed a couple of things having moved back to Australia from America. It's been good to be back home, but I've noticed that Australia has more wealth and security than almost any other place in the world that I've lived. We are truly the lucky country. But I've also noticed that there is no discernible difference in the level of fear and anger that is in this country compared to anywhere else. More safety than ever before, but the same levels of worry. More prosperity than ever before, but the same levels of anger. We human beings are just seem to be so primed to run on fuel of anger and worry. Now, if that's true for us here in the Lucky Country, imagine what it's like in other parts of the world, maybe other parts of history, say, I don't know, the Iron Age, back all the way when David lived. David's world, the Iron Age, had plenty of reason for fear and anger, violence and honor culture. No concept of human rights, no social safety net. You lived and died by the sword or the will of brutish leaders. There were real, genuine, ever-present reasons for fear and anger. And so it shouldn't surprise us that as we read through David's story, the world is full of violence, full of cowardly and callous decisions, full of random and tragic death. Even David, perhaps especially David, is so often a model not of Sunday school morality, but of anger and fear. So that's what makes the story that we read today even more remarkable. David has become king. He now sits on the throne of Israel. He has consolidated his reign. And now is the time when he's got power and authority that he could show his anger to all those who opposed him. Now is the time to take out anyone who threatens his reign or his throne, to eliminate all the causes of worry in his life. But instead, we read in this story today that David, against all expectations, sits up in bed one morning and asks the simple question, is there anyone still left in the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Is there anyone, says David, that I can show kindness to? In this world of fear and anger back then and even today, that's always a remarkable question. Is there anyone that I can show kindness to? David looks out and he asks if there's anyone that he can help. His enemy, King Saul, is dead, but David wants to find someone that he can show grace, kindness to. And it takes a bit of effort. Showing kindness often does. He has to find the former servant of Saul, a young man named Ziba, and Ziba tells him he knows another young man, a man named Mephibosheth, who was the grandson of Saul and the son of David's friend Jonathan. And Mephibosheth's story is a little tragic. He was being led out and he stumbled and fell as he was being ran away during the war. His mother stumbled and fell and dropped him when he was a little boy, and so he was made lame in both feet. And so David says, how can I show kindness to this one? So how often do we ask this question? How often do I ask it? How often do you ask it? Not, is there anything for me to be angry about? Not, is there anything for me to be worried about? Because we know there always is. But how often do we ask the question, is there anyone I can show kindness to? Now, I want to be clear, that question, because sometimes I get this mixed up in my own head, it's different from the question, who do I need to please today? How do I avoid people being angry with me? Those questions are still often fueled by anger and worry. It's the old fuel just redirected. Now, the question, is there anyone I can show kindness to today, is different. David simply wants to do good to someone who he has no obligation to, no worry of, no fear of, no loyalty to. With this question, David is experimenting with a radical new kind of fuel. It's the fuel of grace. And grace is always radical, back then and even today. And certainly back then, when revenge and violence and tribal loyalty were all that mattered, perhaps it's radical today as well. I think acts of grace are always radical. It made a radical difference in Mephibosheth's life. He was a lame man. In those days, he had no future. He was the grandson of the enemy of the current king. He was looking at a short and brutish and impoverished life. But now, Simply because of David's grace, he would sit at a king's table, and he and his whole family and all his servants had a future, all because of David's grace. Perhaps if you've read David's story, you've been surprised at just how, well, frankly, just how awful David can be sometimes. Violence, stupidity, anger, and impatience. David was very much a man of his time. But another truth keeps coming up in David's story over and over again. You see, the thing about David, even though he had all these problems and genuine problems, David had a good radar, a good sense, a good intuition for all the grace that came into his life. When grace entered his life, he grabbed it, he held on to it. He tended to meditate on the gifts that he had received, the blessings that he'd experienced, and the kindnesses that he'd been given. I mean, note how his whole question is framed. Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake? David says, I want to do kindness for Jonathan's sake. Now who's Jonathan? David reaches back into his past, not to the ways that he was hurt by King Saul, and there were plenty of reasons for anger and worry when it came to his journey with King Saul. But what David chooses to remember, what David chooses to focus on, is the way that he was blessed by Jonathan. Now, you may not remember, but Jonathan was Saul's son. And we learn that Jonathan simply and purely and freely chose to love David. Jonathan showed David grace. Even though it meant that Jonathan would lose the throne, Jonathan chose to love David, the shepherd boy come in from the cold. He showed him love and grace and kindness and hospitality. And David chose that fuel, that memory, that reflection on what Jonathan had done for him to be the fuel that eventually drove his choices. Not the evil, the pain that Saul caused him, but the good, the blessing, the kindness that Jonathan gave him. You see, if our Christian faith means anything in this world, it doesn't mean that we're better or more moral than other people necessarily. It doesn't mean that we're less prone to anger or worry. Certainly our faith in God does not protect us from the same troubles that everybody else faces in this world. What our faith in Jesus offers is the gift of grace. Like David, God says to us, to all who trust in him, is there anyone to whom I may show kindness for Jesus' sake? In this world, Christians are like David, who have been loved without reason by God, just like David was loved by Jonathan. And we are like Mephibosheth, who have been shown kindness when we were just dead dogs for the sake of Jesus. Can we meditate on that grace? Listen, there are so many reasons for anger and worry in this world. Maybe they're increasing. If I was to hear your story, I would probably hear a lot of really powerful fuel for anger and worry. I've got my own. But perhaps one of the things we ought to do as a community of believers and Christians is not to stoke up the worry and anger that we have in our own lives. Perhaps we can help each other as a community to remember, to recall, to meditate on the deep well of grace that God has shown to us. I want to finish with a psalm that David wrote, which just gives us an insight into how David built this life that responded more quickly to grace than it did to worry or fear. In Psalm 63, and David here, even while he was in the middle of the wilderness, was training his mind to meditate on the grace of God. He says, my soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food, and my mouth will praise you with joyful lips when I remember you upon my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night. For you have been my help, and in the shadow of your wings I will sing for joy. Friends, David sang that song over and over and over again, reminding himself to draw nourishment from the grace of God. And over time, even in the violent Iron Age in which he lived, he became a man of grace, both receiving and giving it. Friends, the same is possible and true for us in a world of anger and worry, to become people who drink deeply, to be nourished in our souls by the grace of God, and to offer that wherever we go, to be fueled by grace. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.